Hello again and welcome back. In today's lesson, we'll be looking more at various windows in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition. We'll be working with a lot of the standard user interface controls from the Toolbox. We will also alter the properties of those controls to change the way they look and act within our applications. We will be calling the program's user interface an IDE. IDE stands for Interactive Development Environment. It is a type of software which helps you to create your own programs. Many IDEs exist depending on the vendor and the programming language. As a beginner, when you want to create C# applications, Visual C# 2005 Express Edition is the default IDE. Once your knowledge and experience grows and you're working within a team, your company may give you Visual Studio 2005 Professional or a more advanced version. Now, a decent IDE has many tools to make creating applications easier. In the last tutorial, you'll recall we would just drag and drop a button control from the Toolbox, and we dropped it on the Visual Designer. The display on the designer surface looked exactly like how the form would appear when the end user would run our application. There was no need to write code to draw the form or make it the right size and position on the screen. But something did write that code. Whatever you do in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition is writing code for you. When we double-click to write the code to display the message box, the actual act of double-clicking on the button generated code. So that's basically how the IDE helps you write applications much faster than if you were doing the coding yourself in Notepad and text file, and then try to compile it manually. There are lots of tools in Windows in Visual C# 2005, and they have various jobs. Some help you write code or configure aspects of your application. Some help you find your mistakes. Others help you search and locate code which have already been written. All these tools have to appear somewhere on your screen so you can use them when you need to. Now, Microsoft has placed these tools in places so that they only appear when you need and disappear when their job is done. So we'll begin by creating a new project and call it Lesson 2. What I'll do is show you how to work with the windows that will appear within the IDE. So when I hover my cursor over the toolbox on the left-hand side, it jumps out so that I can find the control and drag it to my designer surface. If I needed to drag over 15 or so controls because I'm building my form, I'd have to keep dragging and dropping the controls one by one on the design surface. And as the toolbox window vanishes each time, I'd have to wait for it to jump out and find the control I need. So it's quite slow and repetitive. I'd rather have the window always visible so that I can do my work and not have the form covered up on the right hand side. Also, I'd like all controls which are in the toolbox to always be visible. So I would need to disable the auto hide. Now there's a pin icon in the title bar, and this can be clicked and it will hold the window down and the auto hide gets removed. This way the window stays in place on the left-hand side. Nothing is being hidden and we can drag and drop controls. Once finished, you can click on the Auto Hide button again and it returns to its original setting. I can also change where the toolbox is placed. I can select the title bar and hold down the left mouse button and drag that window and place it somewhere else on my screen. Once I've completed my work, I can drag it back to where it previously was. You'll notice that when I'm dragging the window, I get some visual helpers to indicate where the window will be when I place it on the screen. So if I move my cursor with the window to the left, I get a blue indication of where the window will go. So then I'll release the button on my cursor and put the window in place. Then I can change the size of the window by slowly using my cursor until it changes the move icon. This lets me move the window to the right or left to resize it correctly. You'll only be able to move the window as long as it's pinned down and the auto hide is on. On the right hand side there are two windows visible. Each has half the space available on top of the Solutions Explorer and the bottom of the Properties window. You'll notice that each of these windows are pinned down on the right hand side. Now, I'm going to select the title bar on the Properties window, and like I did with the toolbar, drag it and find the icon that will show how I want this to be displayed in the IDE. The middle cursor will be what I want, and that is to take up the whole screen. So I have a Properties tab at the bottom and a Solutions Explorer tab at the bottom, and now I can tab back and forth between the windows. This comes in useful when you have to have both windows at your fingertips, but you don't want them visible at the same time. We could have the windows on the right hand side split, with 2 or 3 tabs along the top and 2 or 3 tabs along the bottom. So to put the Properties window back to where it was, we have to go to the Properties tab at the bottom, click it, and keep it held down, and then select the icon at the bottom to drop it into place. So we've discussed windows on the left and right, but there are also windows which are horizontal, like the errors list at the bottom. So if we have any problems, those would show here for us to be able to fix. Anyway, we'll discuss this in the next lesson. So this window operates in the same way, but due to the data that it contains in a grid style, we have a description file, a line called projects. And this is all spread out so it has a tendency to a more horizontal perspective, but we can change that. We can pin and drag it to the Properties window. But it's obvious that this wouldn't be the ideal place for an error list, as there's too much info and it gets overcrowded. So we can drag it back to where it was and turn on the auto hide. If the error list is no longer required, we can select the close button on the right hand side of the title bar and it disappears for good. It doesn't appear when the cursor hovers over it. To retrieve anything you may have closed down, you have to go to View menu. There you'll find a list of all the typical windows and a list of supplemental windows that you could also make available in your IDE. Now I want to get back the error list and I find it, and it's back where we started from. So now let's look at learning cool user interfaces with WinForm applications. In the last lesson we learned that if you want to take a control from the toolbox and place it in your designer surface, you need to drag and drop it into place. However, you can do it another way. You find the control that you want and double click it in the toolbox and it will appear on your form. Here the control covers up the one behind it, so we need to use our cursor and get this cross, click down and hold it and drag it into place. The toolbox has controls arranged according to their type, so the dialog controls are together, etc. So I'm collapsing and expanding these controls by clicking the plus and minus buttons. So when you're not using those controls, this is how you can keep them out of the way. I will be using the common controls, so I'll put them onto place here so I have easy access to them, but they won't be affected by the other controls around the toolbox. When you have a control on your designer surface, you can move it about and resize it by using one of the handles on any of the corners of the control by clicking and holding and expanding or contracting it, similar to how you'd do it on a window in Windows XP. So you can change the size and move it around, etc. To change the look and functionality of your control, you'll have to write some code. Now you don't need to type the code yourself, you can take the use of the Properties window. The Properties window allows you to change the properties of the control, i.e. the appearance, its text, size and color, its functions, whether it can be drag and dropped or resized, etc. Each control has some common properties, but each control also has a few properties that are unique to that particular control. So that's why each control in your toolbox is important in its own way. Keep in mind that there are certain properties that are common across all the controls. As you go along, you'll learn that what the certain differences are in each control and use them accordingly to your advantage. Now, if you recall, I'd said every time you make a change in the properties window, the IDE is making a change behind the scenes in the underlying code. We'll talk about where this happens a little bit later on. So we'll look at some of the properties that are common to most of the controls that we'll work with. So first we'll change the width and the height. In order to do that, we'll go to Size Property, expand it in order to see the actual width and the height. So this has a width of 118 pixels and a height of 107 pixels. Let's change the width. So we'll make it wide but not very tall. Then we'll change the top of the left by changing the location. So this is the X and Y coordinate from the top left hand corner of the window. So we'll change the X to 30 and change the Y to 120. So we've moved it up from its location and a little to the left. We then need to give our control a name. By default, each control will have a default name followed by a number. That number will increase for each control you put on. The next button would be number 3, for example. It's actually better to give the controls more significant names which you'll remember, because you may need to refer to them while you're typing code. So we can rename this to OK button. Then we'll change the text that appears on this button. So scroll up to the text, and even though the name has changed, the text hasn't changed, and it still says button 2. So we'll type in OK. We can also change the background and foreground color. So by default, it is going to use a system color. Basically, there'll be a palette of colors available depending on what the user's system colors are. So if they change in Windows XP, they will conform to that color scheme. But we can change it by selecting a custom color. So we can select red, and then we can change the foreground color. This will also affect the font color by doing the same thing. So let's change the font to Arial Black. And make it bigger to, say, 14. Then we can bold it and put it in italics. So now we've created a button, but we need to follow some best practices when building user interfaces. Now, as you get more experienced in programming, you'll hear more and more about best practice. I shall give you 3 best practices for user interface design. There are also lots of books written on this subject, so it's something that will help you get started. So, the first best practice that you should think in terms of columns and rows. So ensure you follow a logical pattern when arranging your controls. When creating a data entry form or a form that allows users to change the properties of your applications, try to keep the labels in one column on the left and keep the controls where the data will be entered on the right. The action buttons like OK, Apply and Cancel should always be in the bottom right-hand corner. Second best practice is make sure you keep to the standard fonts and colors. as it will make sure applications appear much more professional. You may be building certain applications like for consumer or media applications which require funky skins, but initially it's better to stick to the standard ones so your end users are familiar with how your program operates. The third best practice is to use standard or descriptive names for your controls. This applies mainly to controls like buttons and labels. Use OK, try not to use words like do it or go. Keep it simple and clear so that your end users understand how your program was intended to be used. So now let's look at some of the most important controls that you'll use in probably every project that you work on. At the end of these lessons, we'll be using most of these controls in our RSS Reader project. So now I'll make up a customer service or sales inquiry application. This will basically introduce us to some of the common controls in a very common scenario. So we'll add a couple of buttons to the designer surface. Remember, we use buttons to tell the application that the user wants to do something. So here we want to add an OK and cancel button. And I'll also change the text properties of each button. Now, we use labels to put information on the computer screen, like help text. So, we want to add 4 or 5 labels. We can add in their customer name, service representative, and product interested in. Following this, we'll add text box control. This basically lets our users type in any kind of text they want. So, these text boxes tend to be used where there is a free run of text. We wouldn't use them for controls like states or countries where there's a fixed number of correct answers. Then we'll add a checkbox. This is used for closed questions such as yes or no answers. So here we'll ask if the user wants us to send a catalogue. If you have multiple catalogues in one company, you can use 3, 4 or 5 checkboxes in order to send out more than one catalogue. There is something called the radio button which looks similar to the checkbox. This radio button is basically used for multiple choice selections where only one selection could be true. So in this case it can only be male or female, so we'll put in male. Here you'll see that the checkbox and radio buttons have their own labels connected to them. So it's possible for us to delete the value for male or female or send catalogue and our own label, but actually it's more convenient to use the one that's already in that control. We then have a control called list box. This displays lots of possible values depending on how it's configured. The user can either select one or more values in the list box. Whilst the list box has similar functions to the radio buttons and the checkbox, the radio buttons take up a lot of space because whenever you add a new option, you have to add a new radio button. The list box is that when we add more items to it, they get added to the bottom of the list and these would not be visible. If there are a lot of items, there would be a scroll bar which allows you to scroll up and down. The other thing about the list box is that it has a common task arrow on the right hand side. These basically act as shortcuts to help speed you through the development process. Here you can edit items and do lots of things. So we'll click the Edit Items link at the bottom of this common task window. This lets us input a list of items, and we'll add each item to a separate line on the box. So we'll add things from our catalogue which the customer may be interested in. The next control is the combo box. This is a cross between a text box and a list control. This allows you to make a list of items that the user can select from, but if the items don't fit, then the user can add a value that's not in the list. It basically saves space as it looks more like a text box, but it also has a drop-down list. It has the benefit of a list box as it can be set to only select one of the items on the list, thus saving space. This also has a common task window which allows us to add items. Following this is the menu strip control. So we have to go to the menu section, which is within our toolbox, and we can drag and drop a menu strip onto the designer surface. The menu strip gives you a list of options which can be set in order to change the operation of the application. We can type in our own list of items. So File, then make a submenu, create an item underneath called Open, an existing file, and so on. You can also create the Common Tasks window and select standard items. On the left-hand side, there's little icons, and we can make events for each one of these selections, which the end user might make. So we could double-click on this to write code, and that allows this information to be saved. Or write code behind this click event, so that if somebody clicks this menu item, then it would create a new customer inquiry form. The next control is also in the Menus and Toolbar Toolbox section. This is called the Toolbox strip. So we'll drag and drop that underneath menu. The Tool strip gives you a number of icons which you will use most within your application. So to add items to this tool strip, we need to click the down arrow and select the type of item that we want to add. We have options like a label or a combo box, or we can add a progress bar. There's lots of options, but generally we'll choose an icon to represent an action we want to take within our application. Now, if we want to change the graphical value, we need to select a particular button on the tool strip and change the image. So click the ellipsis and select a local resource and click import. So from the available icons, click waste and select OK. So there you can see a waste paper basket icon within our form. We can also select this item within our tool strip and change the text. The next control is a status strip. So drag and drop that from the toolbox. This basically lets you send messages to your user at the bottom of the form. You can also insert a status bar, and this can let your user know the progress of the task. So add a status label. This allows me to update this label as my application is running. So now there's another control called the tool strip container, which we'll use in our RSS reader application later in the series. This control hosts other controls like the menu strip, the tool strip, and the status strip. If you've previously used Microsoft Word 2003, you can drag anything like a menu or a toolbar or anything and place it on another side. So we've looked at some basic controls and ways to set the properties. So now here are a few tips for you that will make life a lot easier. So the first tip is that make sure that you have selected the correct control before you start changing things about in the properties window. So if you're unsure about what you've selected, you can go into the properties window and select the item that you want to change. So find its name, like label 2, and you'll see that the selection caret is around label 2. And I can change the properties, but make sure whichever item is selected is the one that you want to work on. You can check this by looking at what's listed in this combo box under the properties window. Now another way of doing this is by going to View, Other Windows, and select Document Outline. So this lets you see all of the controls from top to bottom. So if you have the menu strip, which has other controls within it, you can see items that are beneath it, like the file menu, etc. And you can select each item that you want to make changes to. Tip 2 is that your users will want to use the tab button on the keyboard to take them from one field to another in a logical way. And this ensures that they don't need to take their fingers off the keyboard when inputting information. So when you add controls, each one will be assigned a tab order. So have a look at the tab order property for each of these controls. One has a tab index of 6. One has a tab index of 11. They're not in a logical format. Your user would basically be jumping all over the place. So it's important to change the tab order. So we need to change the tab index property and basically start at 0 and work our way down, starting at the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner of the form. There is an easier way of doing this. We can look at the View tab order. Then there's a series of number buttons that appear on our form. Now I can change the order that the user will tab through the application. So when this form comes up, I want to enter the customer's names. So click on that, and the color changes from blue to white. Also, the number changes to 0 for the first item. And the cursor just automatically appears in the text box. Then when I click the tab button again, I want to go to the service representative combo box. So I click on it for number 1 and carry on with the sequence 3, 4, etc. until all the tab orders have been changed on each control. So to get out of this, click Tab Order again. Now remember, when you design your applications, you want to keep a flow of the tab order, so make sure you arrange your items from start in the upper left hand corner and continue to the bottom right hand corner. Now the last thing we'll talk about is how to arrange your controls neatly. We've seen that when you move your controls around, you get blue guidelines which help you align a control close to your form. Now there is another way to do this. If I have two controls which are misaligned and I want to align them, we can use the Layout toolbar. If you can't see it in your design view, you would right-click in a blank area in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition and view the available toolbars. Now, I have the standard toolbar, which is at the top, and there's also the Layout toolbar. If it isn't on, click it and make sure there's a checkbox next to the word Layout, and the toolbox should show up in the toolbar area above your IDE. Then we want to select some controls we want to test it on. So I'll select List Box and hold down the Control button on my keyboard and begin selecting other controls. The List Box control will be used for comparison. The following controls I select have black control handles. Now that tells me that these will be the affected controls by whatever action I take whenever I use my Layout toolbar. We'll start by using this first button on the left hand side. This will basically align all the controls with black handles with the controls on the left hand side, which have the white control handles. So that moves the combo box to the right. Then we'll also use the Make Same With button. At the moment we can see that the text box and the combo box are a little shorter than the list box. So to make them the same, click this button and you'll see that it gets a bit wider. So we have lots of options. We can increase or decrease the vertical spacing. We can delete the vertical spacing completely. We can center the controls horizontally or vertically and align their middle or tops, etc. So lots of options there. We can also use this button on the layout to enter our tab order. So you can see there are lots of options for laying out the controls on our forms. So that's it for today. We'll start writing code in the next lesson. I do hope you've enjoyed this lesson and understood it. So once again, until next time, take care and bye bye.